Thank you all for coming. There's a quote in the book, it's in the prologue. It says, "The power of the book lies in its ability to make the familiar strange so that the reader sees it in a new light." This notion inspires me to observe about our host, Margaret Harlock, that she has this ineluctable capacity to make the extraordinary ordinary, to elevate the obtuse and to simplify the complex. Margaret has identified great ideas, trends, and moments so that she would help nurture them and to promote them seemingly effortlessly and joyfully. I must say, however, that when I think about Margaret Harlock, it is a contemporary of Wayne Morse that comes to mind, Hubert Humphrey, known as the Happy Warrior. Margaret, you've made the Wayne Morse Center an Oregon treasure. It would be so easy to take all of this for granted. I assure you we haven't. Thank you very much. The guest of honor, Michael Fakhri, shares similar qualities with our host. But I have to pause first to make an observation that some of you may find disquieting, but I need your counsel as to how to handle this situation. You see, as word spreads about Michael's book, you would expect that in an academy that holds decency and fair play sacred, our colleagues at other schools would bask in our collective joy and send us bouquets of good wishes. Not so. Some of these folks are actively trying to steal Michael from us. That is bad enough, but some are so gauche they call me to ask my advice. This is thoroughly shameless. Far be it from me to try and discourage them with untruths, but I feel obliged to warn you that there is nothing wrong with changing the topic if you are approached by some of these people, or to suggest that it might be prudent for them to wait at a minimum for Michael's next book before they approach him. I have been tempted to say that the book would not have been possible without Oregon, but the truth is that Michael came to us after studying with leading scholars at institutions like Toronto and Harvard, so his idea predates Oregon. Still, if genius, as it is said often, is 1% inspiration and 99% perspiration, which I interpret to mean the capacity to execute, it is in this sense that as a community, we can take credit for our role in helping Michael realize his idea. And so in celebrating Michael's singular achievement, we also celebrate our community's commitment to academic excellence. It is not entirely a bad thing that the book is not here for your perusal or purchase. The absence of the book gives us an additional reason to come together again shortly. I have read the book, and my first thought was that Fidel Castro would have appreciated and benefited from this book. I think you all know that Castro, well, some of you may know, he has spoken often about how working alongside the sugarcane workers in his father's farm inspired his revolutionary ideals. Upon seizing power, he described sugar as the most important industry in the country. I really had not thought about this statement and this focus until I read Michael's book. Michael's insight about the central role of sugar, that sugar has played in the development and confirmation of imperial dominance across time and space, would have resonated well with Castro. Yet I wonder how Castro would have reacted to the observation that Michael makes, that perhaps that free trade as an ideology demands subordination of agriculture in the service of industry, which is exactly what the Castro regime did. Castro, like too many other third world aspiring revolutionaries, easily fell into the trap of chasing modernity, privileging industry, at the expense of agriculture. The agricultural workers after the revolution continued as they were before the revolution, as means to the end of industrialization. Castro, like others, could not conceive of an alternative arrangement that did not first immerse them further into the existing one. But I must step outside of our academic interest in international trade and the particular roles played by law, lawyers, law-based institutions to commend the book for its broad accessibility. You see, Michael writes with a captivating style that weaves together a story about people, places, things, and desires. It leaves you with this aha feeling, you know. Without realizing it, you've just engaged the GATT, the MFN, Smoot-Hawley, the Anti-Boundary League, British imperialism, etc. It is then that you get disturbed. The only thing missing for me, Michael, in your work is I still don't have a way to convince my loved ones that Truvia, or whatever that is not an acceptable substitute for sugar. See, American law schools are often looking for international trade law scholars, mostly because those hired quickly give up trying to write about it. While international trade law has remained a lucrative field for a small select group of practitioners, its history, institutions, doctrines, and practices have been almost deliberately walled off from everyday legal discourse. Michael's book, as many of the reviewers have noted, will open up the field to a new generation of interdisciplinary scholars. It is also, as Duncan Kennedy had recently stated, a joy to read. Michael Fakhri.
Thank you everyone for coming here. I have to admit, finishing a book, this is my first one, is extremely disorienting. I've been thinking about this book. I wake up every day and worry about footnotes and covers and deadlines, and now I stop worrying, which is a weird feeling. So thank you everyone for being here, and thank you to the Wayne Morse Center, to Margaret Halleck, to Rebecca Flynn, to Abby Stilley. You have made my experience in Oregon phenomenal. It really has made this place home in a way that no one else would let this crazy book happen except you guys. Thank you. And to Ib, a comrade in exile who our daily conversations, his office is right next to mine, makes me feel less crazy on a regular basis. I can say stuff where he'll take it somewhere even more extreme and make me feel sane and comfortable. And so he's a true comrade in that sense. So I'm not going to spend too much time talking. I want to open up to a conversation and to hear what you have. And to get to the food, to be honest, that's really why we're all here, is to eat and hang out. But I want to share with you where this book came from. I want to highlight what it's about really quickly. And I want to give you a sense of where this book is taking me into the future. And there are two origin stories to this book. And I'm going to tell you both origin stories. The first begins about 15 years ago. It begins 15 years ago, almost to the day. And it actually has a Eugene connection. It actually kind of starts in Oregon. On November 30th, 1999, there was a huge protest against the World Trade Organization during a ministerial meeting in Seattle. This mass demonstration was actually part of a larger global justice movement. It wasn't just about the WTO, it was about the IMF, the World Bank, it was about all these international financial institutions, and this was a pushback by groups that usually wouldn't hang out together. Environmentalists, feminists, students, anarchists, socialists, labor unions, all agreeing on one thing, that something needs to change. At the time, I was actually in law school. I was a law student. And I was involved a little bit, I was a student activist, and I was involved a little bit in the organizing of students. I was in Ontario, and organizing students in Ontario, how to get them on a bus over to Seattle. So I did some of the logistics and some op-eds and all of that. And so as you can guess, it's the same time of year as now, exams were looming. Papers, deadlines, and I had a choice. I had a huge tax law exam coming up within a week of the protests. And as all of you would appreciate, tax law is brutal. And so I had to decide, what am I going to do? And you won't be surprised, I'm an academic for a reason. I decided to study for tax law. I didn't go to the protest. And that would make the professors here very happy to hear that, of course. That's not a lesson for the students here. Make your own choice. Just do well, however that works for you. So I studied for my tax law exam. But after the protest, I still thought about the whole thing about the WTO, and I took trade law and did very well. But what I realized, I still didn't know what this thing was that I was so angry about. I didn't know exactly how the WTO operated. I knew its effects. I knew its effects on environmental issues, labor issues, social issues. But I didn't know why it existed. Why is it that one major way that we organize international trade is through this thing, this multilateral organization, this international institution? What a weird thing this is. So that's one impetus behind the book. Why is it that we have international trade institutions? So to me, questions of why are historical questions. So sugar lets me tell that story. So more specifically, the book goes through 3 different sugar treaties. One from 1902, which is about the British Empire, the West Indies. 1937, which is about Cuba, the League of Nations, and the imperial relationship between Cuba and the United States. And 1977, which is a story about the United Nations, about international commodity agreements, and the General Agreement of Tariffs and Trade, the precursor to the WTO. And I'm not going to go into the details of those stories, the institutional details. But one way of thinking to tell you what this book is about, let me give you an alternative title. So the title is, here's my plug, shameless plug, Sugar in the Making of International Trade Law. But really, the title I wanted, but it's not going to sell books, the title is Capitalism, Imperialism, and International Law, an unfortunate and unstable love story. That's really what this one's about. So let me tell you what that story is about. It's a story of sugar, which begins as a humble plant, a long grass that first grew wild in South Asia. It then is cultivated by people and becomes sugarcane. Eventually gets picked up by Arab traders in Persia and makes its way to Europe through the Umayyad Empire and through crusaders heading home. And you can imagine with sugar, it's like an addictive drug. When you find and discover and refine your sugar, it blows your mind. It becomes central to imperial expansion, slave labor, and my book enters the story when sugar becomes a global commodity. Starting around 1850, sugar spreads across the world, and it goes hand in hand with the spread of industrialization and the technology that follows with that. The book begins when sugar beet rises. So up until 1850, it's a story of sugarcane. Sugar beet enters the world, and sugar beet is grown in cold, dark earth of Europe. And it challenges the dominance of sugarcane growing tall in the warm colonies. So this is what I'm trying to understand. How a plant, biomass, really transforms into a global commodity. So in trying to write this book, I struggled to find a narrative that would hold the whole thing together. So I needed something to help me travel across space and time. So I thought, okay, I'm writing about towering empires and rebellion, technology and commerce. My prose is really clunky, it's dense, it's rambly, and it's probably only going to be read by a small bunch of nerds. The cover though, I knew the cover was going to be super cool. So what the hell am I writing? I'm writing science fiction. That's the genre that was an inspiration for how I structured the book. And it was in my conversations, not just at this law school, but across campus, with Laura Bavilsky, with Michael Haynes Garcia, with Omar Naim, that I realized how sugar is like a story about a robot, really. In my book, law and multilateral institutions act like a technology. Law transforms biomass, the plant, into a global commodity. Sugarcane can come from anywhere in the world, and up until the 1970s, it's sugarcane or sugar beet. Now we have corn in the story. It was grown by former slaves, Indian indentured servants pushed out of India into the West Indies, Chinese indentured servants who were poor at home and needed somewhere to go and ended up working in the West Indies. It was grown by Russian serfs, by Cuban smallholders who later became elite and the ruling elite of Cuba, negotiating imperialism with the United States. But regardless of all this context, of all the blood and tears and sweat and machetes and dirt Regardless of all of that, law turned sugar into a uniform thing. Didn't matter where it came from, it all ended up in your coffee anyway. Law also created a global market, so sugar could be bought and sold anywhere in the world. What a peculiar idea. So for a law to operate like a technology, people have to assume certain things about law. They have to assume that law is made by humans, and it's made in order to improve human life. That law is functional, coherent, cohesive, pragmatic. So what did I find out in my studies? Let's jump to the last page of the book, right? That's often how we read a book. Read the intro, what's the punchline, and we get back to our day. So this is how I end the book. That the assumption, and Eve touched upon this, that the assumption held by the architects of trade institution has been, for the most part, that agriculture's principal role in the world is to serve industry. Trade law has been part of a larger development plan whose end goal is to use the financial gain from agriculture in order to industrialize. And for the most part, international trade law was a contest between agriculture and industry, or in today's terms, between developing and developed countries. Today, this same tension over the last 100 years defines WTO negotiations, which are more or less still in a deadlock. So how do we get out of this deadlock? Well, one way would be to reimagine what we mean by law. And this takes me past the book to where my research is going. The robot angle was wonderful, and in the book I reference Frankenstein and Modern Times by Charlie Chaplin. I end with Frank Herbert's Dune, but then I was at an endpoint. I was stuck. It's such a tragedy where the machine often either wins or collapses in this very sad story. So it was useful, but it was a dead end to think about the future. And only now do I realize that the other origin story of the book is more about my own personal history. That I was really writing an autobiography, and those of you, many of us write for a living, even in weird academic law stuff, there's a lot of autobiography in what we do. So this is where I think my work is going, is how I'm going to get past this deadlock. The protagonists in the book, none of them are lawyers. I talk a lot about law, but the protagonists are instead peasants, third world nationalists, businessmen, civil servants. This is a list of what everyone in my family has been doing for a living for the last 4 generations. This is a genealogy of professions in my family. In fact, and this is where I want to end, my father, Joe Fakhri, exemplifies all these professions. He recently retired and he moved back with my mom back to Lebanon, and they decided, let's move back to the village. So they have the house in Beirut and they have the house up in the mountains in Lebanon. And up until he retired, he was a civil servant, he was a businessman, and an international commercial diplomat. But now that he's retired and returned to the village, he's going back to our family's roots as peasants. So here's this story. We, our family, the Fakhri family, have always been apple and cherry growers. My grandfather starts working in the hotel industry, he dies, and then the land is in a property law dispute for about 3 decades. Right? So there's the law story there. And it's family law. And we get lawyers and judges, and we bribe this person, and we go to this case, and we do that, and it's just this endless mess of drama. You can imagine what dinners and holidays were like, right? And finally, when my father retired, it timed out, the timing was perfect, where he finally got a little plot of land for himself, not much bigger than this room, with a bit big, maybe twice the size, with the apple trees, and that was his. Not shared, it was his. And so this is the first year he was growing apples. And he was super excited, so I wanted to invite him to come in the fall, just to visit Lisa and me, to enjoy fall in Oregon. And so we're calling and trying to figure out, and on the best of times, I'm bad with timing. My dad is also a little scattered when it comes to time. But he told me this, he said, well, we're not sure when we can come, or if we can come, because we have to wait for apple season. And once we know when apple season is this year, and once we see what this year's crop will be, well, then we'll buy our ticket, Habibi, and we'll come visit you. And I thought, he figured it out. Imagine if we bought our tickets and organized our lives, and if prices fluctuated, and if we related to each other, and we start the school year, when apple season kicks in, whenever that is that year, what if there was a drought? What if there's no fruit this year? What if we need more people to work to get this year's bumper crop or not? And then we organize our institutions and the way we relate to each other around those modes of interaction and those relationships. So this is where I want to end today, which is how I end my book, with more questions. So here's where my new research agenda is going. What if we no longer privilege the idea of industry with its attendant values of mechanical speed and economic growth? What if instead we use agriculture as an ideation starting point? And I appreciate that the line between agriculture and industry is becoming blurred. With, we have things like patented seeds, chemical fertilizers, large-scale mechanized monocrop farming. But that blurriness is in a very particular direction. Agriculture looks more like industry every day. So after an age of industrialization, the questions that might open the horizon of possibilities may very well be the following. How could we interpret and change trade law in a way that assumes that industry should serve or even resemble agricultural practices? What does it even mean to think about agricultural cultivation as an end in and of itself? In answering these questions and in order to transform law for the future, we may want to explore agricultural practices that consider values such as ecological resilience and biological diversity. Thank you all for coming today. So Margaret has said maybe we can open it up to a conversation, to questions. If any ideas you have, I really know, and most of you have not read it, just whatever comes to mind. The reason I picked sugar is when I was a grad student, I felt obliged, like I'm so lucky, oh my God, I get to nerd out for a living, that I have to pick something that if anyone waiting for a bus, someone says, well, what do you do for a living? I'm not going to tell them, well, theories of empire and blah, blah, blah. I had to have a good I picked an everyday commodity. So on the cab ride, the cabbie said, why are you all dressed up? I said, I write about sugar. And that was a 20-minute conversation. So I really would love to hear what you have what's on your mind today. Tom.
Great presentation. I don't know much about this field. I wonder if world systems theory has merit separate from law. I wonder if there would be this tripartite separation of the world into the core, the semi-periphery, and the periphery. Even if law didn't necessitate it, would the economies, the integrated world economies naturally result in that stratification? Or is it law that contrives that stratification?
So thank you. That's a wonderful question. So clearly the work of Emmanuel Wallerstein and world systems theory has informed this book. So just to quickly say for those of you that haven't read that sort of work, the idea is that we have a world of periphery where the agricultural part is primary commodities, and we have the core or the center, the industrial parts of the world that consume those raw materials. And the book is structured around those same ideas, Tom, you're totally right, of how the economy, you can understand the world as a system between periphery, semi-periphery, and the core. And the question is it a natural alignment of the economy and separate from law? I think that's right. This is where I want to bring it back to agriculture. There's something about, for example, how sugar cane is grown that matches this idea of periphery and core. So when you grow sugar cane, you have to, often you do it by hand with a machete because they wouldn't invest in technologies. You have to immediately process that at a central factory of some sort because it'll rot very quickly. But it'll process it. Whoever owns that processing plant has the most power. That's one of the centers of power. So all the workers feed into this centralized system of it's not refining the sugar just yet. They create a raw form of sugar. So when you go to the supermarkets or anywhere, we're in Eugene, you buy 16 types of sugar on the corner store. When it's that muscovado sugar, that moist, brown, sweet, molasses type sugar, that's what you get from that first step. And then you send it to the refiners. Well, where are the refineries? They're in the eastern seaboard of the United States, they're in the rich countries. So there's that, and then they ship it there. And the most value is often in that last phase of processing. So I think law has a big, there's something about how agriculture works there. I think law has a big role to play because we treat the center as the rule. We can treat the center as law is rule and exception. That's one form of law. Well, what if the exception is those centers of refinement? And the rule, the norm, the people that establish the core ideas are the agricultural producers. That's one aspect. But the problem with this center-periphery thing is it still locks us in an agriculture versus industry relationship. And I want to try and break through that and open up our sense of geography. That's still a very industrialized way of thinking. So I'm still sort of, I need a different geographical sensibility to get through that. So that's why I'm telling the story. I need to start looking at things like property law. So maybe to get out of a center-periphery story, what does trade look like where I start with a story about a garden or my father's orchard or something like that, or modes of distribution? What's trade law? Trade law is a way of exchange, of distributing resources. What's the other institution where we do that? The family, right? When we're at home, the cooking, who buys the stuff? What are you growing in your garden? Who eats more? Who does what work? That system of distribution, the family's institution. So I want to think, what if trade law, what if we taught, here's a weird idea, what if we taught trade law as part of family law, right? What if we taught gardening, family law, and trade law all as modes of distribution of food? So it's sort of to change the geography. Margaret.
So I like where you're going in your research, but it just seems to me to be impossible when you have institutions like the WTO. I mean, how do you break through those giant international institutions which do serve industry to get to a different privileging of other aspects of growing food?
That's so I find myself in a weird, in starting in 1999, I forgot to mention, the Eugene Connections, the anarchists that organized in those protests, were and are based in Eugene. So because of the activism of Eugene, I knew what the WTO was. But the WTO of 1999 is not the WTO of today. Today, all the people at the WTO are looking for new ideas. So for example, a colleague of mine, Frank Garcia, in Boston, he writes about theories of justice in trade and was recently invited to give a talk about justice at the WTO. So they're looking for new ideas, and there isn't this sort of agreed consensus over what even a market means, what trade law is supposed to serve. So now I think politically, in terms of if we think in tactical terms, what to do now in the short term and institutional terms, the WTO, let's give it agency for the sake of argument, is a humble, confused place looking for new ideas. So this is the time to inject it. And I find, I worked hard to be irrelevant. I ended 1977. I don't want to have to keep up with current affairs. Everyone in the story is dead. I can sit in the archives and figure it out. But a couple of weeks ago, weirdly, the trade negotiations have made, I think, my work a bit more relevant in the tension between, to bring you up to speed, those of you who don't follow the minutiae of trade law, India and the United States had a huge debate over food reserves. India wants to have huge stockpiles of food reserves in order to serve people when there's a shortage in case of emergency. Those contravene trade law. But in the book I talk about commodity agreements for 100 years is about stockpiling, about different types of institutions. So I hope in the book and where people are thinking today, we can redesign pre-existing institutions and not just the WTO. That maybe focusing on the WTO distracts us from other institutions that might be the answer of how better to do things. And the WTO is more humble. We don't have to fight it anymore. It sort of now is a bit more, it knows its place a bit more amongst other institutions and ideas. John. I have more than 2 answers.
So the first one is I'm really happy that you've done this, and I'm really happy that you can now move on away from this frivolous work on your sugar high into something really important like water.
Water, right.
The second question is, when you're talking about new institutions, which you just mentioned, what if you have some thoughts about the whole rent-a-judge process called international arbitration that is equally important?
So thank you for those questions. So I'm going to deflect your question because the resident and national water law expert, Professor Adele Amos, who just is sitting with us today. But I'm going to use this as an opportunity. I'm going to one-up you. And what about energy? So this is where my work is going now. Here's what I'm trying to think. What's so unique about agriculture? So some people will say, well, we need food and agriculture to survive. Okay, but we need air and food, and okay, we need water too. So how is agriculture different? So my thinking is, first, agriculture is our most sustained and intense engagement with the biosphere. That's where we negotiate and say something about life. And so the verbs we use when we think about agriculture is about growing. It's about resilience. And it's cyclical, life and death and life and death. That's sort of the dynamic of agriculture. So the law will have a different story in that dynamic. Water is a finite resource, and it's always going to be the same amount of water, and the verb is flow. Water flows. So the law and politics about water is about flow. So of course those relate, but we have to think that's a different system, to go back to world systems. And again, it's a resource that's not growing, where we can create a little bit more water, but nothing significant. And so it's a different type of cycle. And then to go and it's an engagement with the hydrosphere, right? So then energy. What's so unique about we need energy to survive? That's a verb where we're talking about extraction and destruction, right? When we're talking about those sorts of natural resources. So my thinking is going into food and agriculture, which is, those are all different logics, and there's all different theories of law. That's far more interesting than saying, what is WTO law about? I want to sort of embed it in those sort of thinking about hydrospheres, biospheres, and the like. On international commercial arbitration, so where my work is going, there's this idea in commercial arbitration that there's the law of the merchant, that there's the law of interaction of business people and commercial actors. And that the focus is, well, in these disputes between the big companies, they go to private arbitration, and they develop their own law separate from the courts, separate from the state, separate from constitution, separate from public values and the common good, to go to the Wayne Morse theme of a couple of years ago. So the next project I have is to ask, well, who is this merchant? Is the peasant a merchant? Is the worker in the field who doesn't have land a merchant? Is the documentless Mexican agricultural worker in the United States a merchant? And are the practices and norms and habits derived from those relationships? Those should inform those commercial disputes that are often ignored. So that's sort of where my work is going. In the back, Malik. Thank you.
My question is, what about South America using sugar now as biofuel? How does that change the equation for the future of sugar and for our future as consumers?
So the question for those of you over here, what about in South America the use of sugar as biofuel? And the reason I sighed, that's why I started to have to figure out what's the difference between energy, the hydrosphere, the biosphere, and the like, is to take a step back. The price of sugar, our table sugar that we have every day, is directly affected by the price of oil because of how ethanol is used. So that sugar grown now is used either for food or energy. And I highly recommend Googling Stephen Colbert, sugar and ethanol. He does this better than I do, not surprisingly. So this is taking me where I don't know anything. This is where I realized when the book ended, I need to learn about energy law. But isn't that depressing? We're studying a story about agriculture and about eating. It means I need to study energy law and the fluctuations of that. And to say that my instinct is, I think we have to be wary that the notion of biofuel sounds green, whatever that means, but we need to be very careful where we're going with that. Yeah. Adele, oh dear.
Somebody opened the water law.
Yes.
So I'd love to get your reaction. One of the huge dynamics in water law is this question of commodification. For whatever reason, as we've developed water law, we've hesitated to fully commodify it, and it's reflected in the law over and over again. So I'd love your sort of sense from this work on sugar, where it was a resource that became fully commodified, and as a result, sort of that relationship, and any observation you have for other areas that feel the pressure to go in that direction but have not.
Right. So my first response is resist when possible, right? And when that fails, we immediately should have tactics and tools ready for when we're on to the next stage where the consensus has arisen, we're all going to commodify water. Immediately the lawyers can be weirdly relevant and progressive and radical and say, well, what do you even mean by commodification? And we're going to tell you what it means, and we're going to tell you what it means in a progressive way that is egalitarian and derived by principles of social justice. So to be ready for that, if and when it happens, what's interesting then is one can say, okay, we're going to commodify, but let's not do it in a singular way. Right? Let's experiment and have multiple systems of commodification, not necessarily global commodification. So then we're redistributing and redirecting the flow of water in different ways, and we can experiment and see what people are doing, but so that it doesn't concentrate power. So this is generally my resistance, is any system, any law, any mode of production that concentrates power in the hands of a very small number of people is rarely a good thing. Whereas if we commodify it, fine, if we lose that battle, we can still try and commodify it that spreads decision-making and spreads the power in a way that is both functional, so we don't have the drugs, yet pluralistic in how it disperses power. Ian.
You pointed out in the book that Marx himself was a supporter of free trade. So the two great antagonistic forces of modernity, in a sense, both supported this commodification of activities, of products and the like. And I know you recognize that, this dichotomy between agriculture and industry doesn't necessarily mean that industry is all bad and agriculture good, because a lot of people have been able to find freedom by escaping from sort of the bucolic life of the countryside and agriculture and all that. Industrialization did create opportunities for freedom, for movement and the like, right? So we're not going to go back,
no,
right? So what is this engagement that you're proposing in a sense? That's why the socialists and the revolutionists all embraced industrialization, because they saw it as an opportunity for freedom, for greater freedoms.
Yeah, so just for those on the left that didn't hear, so the idea, and Marx was the first to recognize that free trade, industrialization is freedom, it's wealth, it frees people from, often Marx saw it as freeing people from feudal relationships. So I want to be clear that I'm not an agrarian romantic. It's easy to be that in Oregon and in Eugene. The idea is that we're not to do away with industry or machinery or these opportunities that ease the work and the burden of working in agriculture. Anyone who's worked outside knows it's intense and exhausting. But the idea is to think in the future. Like, this is why I wrote a book about history, is to think about the future. So what that future looks like is it's an institutional challenge. It's to say, I don't think international institutions, to connect to Margaret's question, I don't think international institutions are going to drive that push. That if industry is going to be shaped in a way that actually does provide the freedom that it potentially can, it'll be through different legal institutions. It'll be through a focus on things like property law, on things like the household, so it's a different scale maybe is where I want to start. And again, you can't do agriculture without industry today. There's just no way. So I guess what I'm really saying is, rather than thinking, again, it's about what's driving it. Right now, the demands of profit and the demands of machinery is driving it. What if the demand again was, we're out of water, we're hungry, right? So this is the statistic that shocked me and that's driving the new agenda is, in the world, there's some people are hungry. A large number of people are hungry. However you define hunger, 70% of those people who are hungry are agricultural workers. So to Marx, let's go to Marx and move past them, right? He's a good guy, but let's move past him. Marx had this theory of alienation, that the worker in the factory is alienated from the stuff he does. He's working in the factory, but he can't buy the product. He said that's alienation, and it's sad, and it's an existential crisis. Where the agricultural worker is hungry, he can't or she can't eat, even though she's creating food, is absurdity. That's where I want to start. Isn't that absurd? that the hungriest are those that create food. So the system I want to create, or the idea, or the provocation is, how about we have a system that feeds those that are feeding us first, and then we figure everything else out. Right? So that's the idea. Stuart.
Yeah, just following up on your points about the new agenda, which sounds quite exciting. So what is the ambition then? Is the ambition that if the rhetoric used is different than what we have now, that will drive a change in ideas? Is the idea that, by, I don't know, maybe moving outside of the older conceptual forms, that maybe new creative ideas will emerge? What, the sense of optimism you have about maybe reorienting this debate, where does that come from? Is it in the concepts themselves, or can you say more about that?
So where does my optimism come from is part of that question. And what's the, so there's multiple agendas. There's my agenda, which is, look, this book, not a lot of people are going to read. Like I said, it's for a bunch of science fiction law nerds and the like. It allows me to keep doing what I want to do. So basically, this book allows me to think about food and agriculture for the rest of my life. That's one purpose. I want to think about that stuff and hang out with my dad in the old apple orchards. And I'm not being 100% facetious, it's partly true. But the other point is how will change happen? Almost, I hear your question, what's my notion of change? Why am I optimistic about things where is change going to happen? Here, I don't know. I mean, I think the idea comes to who wields the tools. And right now, the way law is, and the way trade law has been going is, it doesn't matter if you're agriculture or industry or a lawyer or a business person or whatever, you're still in the mode of governing. Governing or being governed, resisting or whatever. And I want to change the verbs, I want to change the notions that are informing these ideas to ideas of growing, producing, distributing, but trying to take my scholarship to highlight and emphasize tools that are used by a different group of people, by the people doing the growing. What are all the laws that they have to use? Their life is full of law if you're working in the field. So to sharpen and highlight the tools for those that are hungry to use them as quickly as possible. And to move out of this notion of the government. I think we have one more. How much time? We have one more. Last question.
So I read some articles about this newer BRICS.
Sorry?
It's an acronym, BRICS.
BRICS, yes.
Right.
Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa.
And as being sort of like a competitive bank with the World Bank. And there's a lot of articles talking about how that will help certain countries with their agriculture. Do you have any sort of insight or predictions as to how this will impact?
Right, so the BRICS, the Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, so one term, to go back to world system theories, they're semi-periphery. They're kind of agricultural, they're kind of industrialized, and the like. But they're playing by the same rules. Industrialize, industrialize, industrialize. Make the most out of the system that we have, and change it to redistribute wealth, but still in very geopolitical terms of the governing. Right? So, but you raise a good point about banks. Let me take it to my dad's village in Czech. There was a recent protest. They said to the government, the Lebanese government, which barely exists, they said, you promised us an agricultural bank. What the hell is an agricultural bank? Why are villagers in this tiny remote place where water is free? It's this weird, if you read Asterix and Obelix, you'll get a sense of what this village is like. Why are they demanding an agricultural bank? I want to listen to them, not BRICS. And what they mean by an agricultural bank is a bank that takes, fine, we have to get into finance and we're still in capitalism, but it's a bank that understands the seasons and that understands if it's stuck with these apples, what it's going to do with them and how it's serving the peasants so next season they're still planting apples. Because if the bank loses, we starve. Not now, if the bank loses, our world ends, and we lose our house or whatever. Okay, that's tough. But this is a situation where the stakes are a little different. So that's where I would reframe the question. What's an agricultural bank to those bunch of villagers? So with that, thank you again, everyone.
Congratulations, Michael. You can, as I said before, purchase the book in the bookstore, and please enjoy the refreshments.